All right, moments ago, President Donald Trump wrapped up his meeting at the White House with the Crown Prince of Bahrain. A number of headlines came out of that sit down, including this moment. We wanted to let you listen to it.
He's a terrible Fed chair. I was surprised he was appointed. I was surprised, frankly, that Biden put him in and extended him, but they did. So, no, we're not planning on doing anything. We're very concerned. He's doing a little renovation for $2.5 billion of the Fed, building a renovation, and they have a close to $900 million cost overrun, and it's a shame. But the biggest cost overrun is the cost overrun for interest rates.
So let's get to the White House and CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Okay, Ed O'Keefe, the big question here is, even though the president says that Powell's job is safe for now, to even the most mild critic, this seems like a potential setting of the table.
Well, that is certainly a possibility, Reed, and we know that in recent days the White House has raised concerns, for example, about renovations that are ongoing over at Federal Reserve headquarters just a few blocks from here in Washington. It's a project that's now costing more than $2 billion, has been underway for several years, and the White House is wondering, did Chairman Powell have something to do with that cost overrun? And so you've seen the chairman of the Federal Reserve call on a independent watchdog over there at the Fed to investigate it, lay it all out, and address those concerns. But the reason the White House is raising those is because conceivably a president could remove a Federal Reserve chairman for cause. So by raising that issue, by continuing to speak out publicly with his concerns about Powell in the public sphere while the markets are open, you're potentially laying the groundwork for cause to be cited at some point down the line. But he made clear today in his comments to reporters while meeting with the Crown Prince of Bahrain that he has no plans to fire Powell immediately or anytime soon unless there's fraud. So there he is laying the groundwork. Were he to try to do it at some point, it very well invites a Supreme Court challenge, because earlier this year they ruled that he has the ability to remove Democratic or Republican members of certain independent agencies like the National Labor Relations Board.
Right.
But it said in that ruling the Federal Reserve probably can't do that because it's a quasi-independent agency and in a slightly different realm. Remember, Federal Reserve chairmen are appointed for 4-year terms. Trump was the first to appoint him to his first term during his first presidency. Joe Biden renominated him in 2022. He's serving until next year. But of course, Trump has been raising all these concerns, suggesting he should be lowering interest rates like other countries have. Trump sees lowering interest rates as validation of his economic policy, but the Fed has cited concerns with the forthcoming tariffs as one of the reasons why they don't want to move yet on lowering those rates.
Well, and Ed, this media opportunity today there with the Crown Prince seemed to be a study in what the president wants to talk about, what he wants out in the narrative about certain topics, and what he doesn't want to be out there. And I'm talking about the Jeffrey Epstein files, the most talked about Jeffrey Epstein files. What did he have to say about that?
Well, first of all, he's not the first president to try to bat away questions and topics he doesn't want to talk about and try to change the subject. They all do that. But in this case, he is trying now, after about a week of questions and controversy swirling mostly within his own political circles and among his own supporters, about a Justice Department decision last week to release information in a report on the Epstein situation, which concluded he killed himself, there was no murder, and the Justice Department has since clarified to say there is no client list or list of people that Epstein worked with or worked for in arranging various relationships with prostitutes or underage people as well. So the president saying, look, I got nothing to hide, but there are more important issues and we should move on, and once again defended his attorney general, saying Pam Bondi's on the job, not going anywhere, and that his critics, be they in his party or Democrats especially, should move on to other issues. He's also now suggesting, and he hasn't done this before, that all of this, the Epstein case, the investigations, the alleged lists, and everything else, were created by Democrats. Joe Biden, Barack Obama, James Comey, Christopher Wray, the former directors of the FBI, to discredit him and fellow Republicans. That's a new argument that's emerged in the last 24 hours or so. Comes out of the Trump playbook, and there's no evidence to suggest that that's what happened.
Ed O'Keefe, thank you so much for cutting through all of that. Always great to talk to you. Let's bring in now CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady and re-queue up what we're talking about relative to Jerome Powell, the Fed chair there. As you look at this, what is now being said, some people are saying that this appears to be table setting or preparation or just the initial drum beats to trying to get rid of Jerome Powell. You look at the financial implications. Let's first of all talk about how the markets could or may even react even if it doesn't happen.
So let's talk about the equity market first and then the bond market. So the equity market, the stock market, right? The Dow, the NASDAQ, the S&P 500. If the president were to do something and take this action, you would likely see a big drop off in the stock market. And, you know, you and I have talked about many times that over the past few months we've seen that, and things always come back. So that doesn't mean it would be long term, but really equity investors would be looking at the situation and the lack of potential independence of a central bank, which is the Federal Reserve, would cause a lot of anxiety. You know, what does that mean in terms of interest rate policy? What does it mean in terms of inflation with all of the changes in trade policy? That's where you might see a big rout. Here's the interesting thing, though. You sort of play that out over the next year or so. You would likely expect the president to replace Chair Powell with someone who might favor lowering interest rates. And the markets do love when interest rates go down. So then you could see a swing back depending on who might take his place. The bond market, though, that's a separate issue because the bond market is essentially investors buying government debt. And when you have investors not feeling confident in the economy, the stability of the economy, which is very much tied up in having an independent central bank, I like to say that the bond market throws a bit of a tantrum. They have to pay, the government has to pay higher interest in order for investors to feel comfortable, you know, investing in government debt, holding government debt, which is traditionally something that is supposed to be very stable and safe. It's a safe asset, whereas equities are a more risky asset. So that's where you might see markets react if this were to even happen.
Well, and you heard Ed O'Keefe there mention what the Supreme Court did, and it's been reported that it sort of looked like the Supreme Court carved out space for Jerome Powell and that entire office that he represents to remain separate, to have some autonomy there. Speaking to the structure of how things are formed here in these United States, how important is it that there's that autonomy?
It's extremely important because the Federal Reserve, they are looking at two different things, inflation and the job market. They want to ensure that inflation stays low, comes back to that 2% target. Remember, yesterday we got consumer inflation numbers showing that we're moving away from that target. And they want to be able to have levers, which are the interest rate, you know, how that moves, in order to either boost growth, help a sort of slowing job market, or kind of curb demand and therefore curb inflation. And if you have political influence on the people making those decisions, you would have interest rates super low for forever because, of course, every political party would be able to utilize that and make sure that you and I get our low mortgage rate read, right? And we can go buy our house, low car interest loans. And so that's really why you want sort of any political party, whether it's Democrat or Republican, separate from the Federal Reserve so that they can make those independent decisions to ensure that the inflation and the economic growth sort of stay in lockstep.
I'm particularly interested in this, knowing that Democrats are eyeing the midterms as a chance to reclaim some seats, and it will be fascinating to see what happens with Republicans, with the Trump administration, knowing they also know that the midterms are coming up. Kelly O'Grady, great to talk to you, as always. Thank you so much. So if you're just joining us, of House Republicans, if he should fire Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. He confirmed our CBS News report in the Oval Office earlier today and took more shots at Powell.
He should have cut interest rates a long time ago. Europe has cut them 10 times in the short period of time, and we cut them none. The only time he cut them was just before the election to try and help Kamala or Biden, whoever the hell it was, because nobody really knew. He's a terrible Fed chair. I was surprised he was appointed. I was surprised, frankly, that Biden put him in and extended him, but they did. So, no, we're not planning on doing anything.
planning on doing anything but bringing in CBS News congressional correspondent Nikole Killion in his next breath, or maybe even in the same breath. He talked about what is happening relative to the renovations over at the Fed. But you're watching an entirely different set of offices and building, and that is the reported conversation the president had with lawmakers on the future of Fed Chair Jerome Powell.
Yeah, that's right. Well, obviously, we know through our reporting, but the president also confirmed that he kind of floated this idea or talked to lawmakers about the potential of firing Jerome Powell. But also in that same breath, he said that it's something highly unlikely that he would actually do. So, again, we'll kind of have to see how things play out, whether he decides to move forward with a firing or not. But certainly it is raising concerns here on Capitol Hill. In fact, just a short time ago, we heard on the Senate floor from North Carolina Senator Tom Tillis, who said that if the president were to fire Jerome Powell, that could potentially undermine the credibility of the United States, and express concerns about the potential market implications, considering that, this is an independent position. And so he made the case, certainly just because people in politics may not agree with some of his decisions, at the end of the day, Tillis kind of argued that the Fed chair kind of deserves that space to make economic decisions independently. We also heard a short time ago from Speaker Mike Johnson, who said he does share the president's viewpoints about Jerome Powell, in the sense that he doesn't necessarily think he's doing the best job, but he did raise questions about whether or not the president would have the authority to move forward in firing Powell.
All right, so that's one big talker and headline there on Capitol Hill. But the other one, of course, is Mike Johnson and what he had to say about the potential release of those Epstein files. I think a lot of people are wondering if this isn't a little bit of a break in rank for Speaker Johnson, who has all along been very shoulder to shoulder, very lockstep with the president.
Yeah, that's right. Although now the speaker seems to be walking back his comments a bit, saying that he's being misunderstood and misquoted. He made some of those comments about the Epstein files, suggesting that there should be transparency around them on a conservative talk show. But he told reporters a short time ago that people need to listen to that full interview, because he also said certainly there's a lot of potentially sensitive information in those files, could potentially include information about minors and the like. So it would just have to be a situation where one would have to tread carefully and cautiously before just fully releasing something. So he did try to suggest that, yes, he believes in transparency, but also try to push back against the notion that he's completely breaking from the president on this issue.
Yeah, fascinating. It sounds like Johnson is talking about what could be in the files relative to things that are sensitive. The president used the term credible, so it'll be interesting to see where they meet and whether those files are released with sensitive or credible information. That remains to be seen. But we also want to ask you, last night the Senate advanced President Trump's request to cancel billions of dollars in foreign aid to public media funding. Vice President J.D. Vance issued that tie-breaking vote. What concern are you hearing from lawmakers, especially lawmakers who, as we talked about yesterday on 24/7, represent rural areas that say they really need the force and the thrust of public broadcasting?
Yeah, well, that's certainly one part of the equation. I mean, in terms of this rescissions package, which totals some $9 billion in cuts, this would effectively make steep reductions in global foreign aid, as well as public broadcasting. As you mentioned, the bulk of those cuts, though, really hitting foreign aid more so than public broadcasting, which is about $1 billion in cuts of that $9 billion. But still, we spoke to the head of NPR earlier this week, who said that this could take a toll on local stations who really rely on these grants and federal funding through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to make up a significant component of their budget, certainly much more so than NPR on the national level. So that is a concern. We do know that some funding is being preserved or reallocated, if you will, for more rural stations and tribal areas. That was an ask of South Dakota Senator Mike Rounds, but some critics say, kind of making these deals on the side really doesn't deal with the broader situation at large. So we expect the Senate to continue debating this package for the next couple of hours, and they're hoping for a final vote by tomorrow.
All right, Nikole Killion, thank you so much for that update from halls of Congress.